Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in person, and a big welcome to those who are joining us online this morning. I'm Shihoka Gerto, the director of the Asia program. It's my honor and privilege to be able to welcome you today for our US-ROK-Japan Trilateral Relations Rebuilding and Expanding Economic Cooperation Forum. Historic, groundbreaking, courageous. These are some of the words that have been used to describe the meeting on August 18th between the United States and its most critical allies in the Indo-Pacific. Camp David was also an ambitious summit. It sought to institutionalize relations between the three countries on security, political, and economic fronts. Now, the groundwork leading to advancing trilateral relations towards a new level had been years in the making, but had accelerated at a significant clip from this year with the rapid improvement in bilateral relations between the ROK and Japan. Our forum today is to focus on the outlook for trilateral relations, and it actually represents accumulation of nearly a year's work here at the Wilson Center of exploring areas for cooperation based on shared economic interests, in particular between Japan, Korea, and the United States. Now, we know that supply chain resilience, advanced technology protection, strategic development assistance, sustainable growth, these are shared concerns between the three countries, and they also have shared interests in hedging against economic disruptions, against the unexpected events, and also in advancing economic security, and of course, pushing back against economic coercion. This conference is an opportunity to address how the confluence of shared concerns, and above all, shared political will, can be sustained. And before I turn to my colleague, Kayla Orta, who is the Senior Associate for Korea here at the Wilson Center, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Korea Foundation for its continued support for the Wilson Center's activities related to issues of concern for Korea. And without the Korea Foundation's support, this event and indeed the entire project would not have been possible. So with that, Kayla.
Thank you so much, Shihoko, and thank you, Wilson Center team, for today's To Be Amazing conference. So first, I also want to say thank you to everyone here in the room joining us on a chilly December morning. We've had a bit of technical move-throughs today, and thank you for enjoying breakfast while we move through that space. Thank you also to everyone joining from afar. We have colleagues both in Korea and in Japan, as well as across the United States, joining us for this discussion. The Wilson Center has been a place of excellence focusing on research on Korea work, and I've been very proud to help spearhead research these past 6 months and even longer in the past. This project really comes from a space where the Wilson Center and Korea Center noticed that there's an opportunity for Korea and Japan to come together and an opportunity for the US to help build that space. With the thawing of the relationships, this has opened many windows, and about a year ago, our program sought to see avenues where this could be expanded and to grow. So it is our great pleasure to welcome many of our commission members and our experts who will be joining us today. We have several people with extensive experience in both US and South Korea and Japan government spaces, as well as academic research, joining both in person and virtually. So earlier this year in March, the Wilson Center launched our first ever Trilateral Commission. This was a 15-member commission featuring 12 members from the US, South Korea, and Japan, 4 from each country, as well as 3 co-chairs representing the US, South Korea, and Japan. Japan. And this was actually one of those things where we wanted to build the prospects for what is in the future. And so we boldly titled this project with the subheader, Rebuilding and Expanding US-Japan Trilateral Economic Relations, to highlight the history of cooperation, which already exists among the three countries, but to also emphasize, as I mentioned, these opportunities. I think this was a very bold title. I think you'll hear from our participants today that it was the right title, and you'll be able to see that we are moving forward new ideas and agendas, and we hope to also hear from audience members. So by bringing together these senior level experts from the US, Korea, and Japan, this multinational commission has jointly explored proactive and effective methods to strengthen this trilateral partnership, especially as we look toward the continuing improved relationships between Korea and Japan. So at this point, without further ado, I would like to once again thank Wilson Center leadership, as well as thank our funders. So the Korea Foundation has been fantastic in supporting this project, as I mentioned, over the past year. And it has been an honor to help lead the project over the past 6 months, seeing it come from the very beginning moments to today's present day. So without further ado, I'd like to ask the Wilson Center leadership to join us. Ambassador Green, please, I would like to hear your opening remarks. And I know that you've been a big proponent for supporting Trilateral, so we thank you again for helping us with this project.
Thanks, Kayla. Thanks, Shihoko. And thanks to all of you for coming here today and those who are joining us online. So, as many of you know, we're a unique institution in foreign policy. We're congressionally chartered, we're scholarship-driven, and we're fiercely nonpartisan and independent. In the words of our congressional mandate created more than 50 years ago, our authorization is to strengthen the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. And what that really means is that we go beyond advocacy, we go beyond data and information to look at scholarship, to look at the lessons learned, and to develop the ideas and recommendations that policymakers on both sides of the aisle and both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue that they can trust. It also creates special obligations for us to not duplicate what others are doing, but instead to prioritize, look for the most important issues and ideas, and to look at those opportunities where we can add value. And the relationship that we're here to talk about today fits that bill. It is one of the most important burgeoning relationships in the world today, terrifically important, and I think a very hopeful one. As you heard, in August, the leaders of these three countries hosted an unprecedented Trilateral Summit at Camp David. It was aimed at initiating new platforms that can empower, strengthen, and expand trilateral cooperation in the years ahead. That cooperation would have seemed unimaginable just a few years ago. And so the fact that these countries, these leaders are getting together and taking up this cause and looking for ways to build and expand the relationship, that's about as good, I think, a bit of news for all of us as I can imagine. Now, there is much work to be done. This cannot be the meeting at Camp David and the work that we've done to date. It cannot be a flicker. It must be a glowing candle that lights the way to a more exciting future. We know that the issues that will be taken up are important for all the countries involved. You heard as Shihoko laid some of them out. Most importantly, I think, are the non-traditional security issues, the economic issues. I think we all recognize that economic strength, trade, investment, commerce, that's not only important for the economic reasons, but that's really how you build power and strength. And I think the three countries working together have an opportunity to uphold and reinforce the rules-based order. They have an opportunity, I believe, to build out and expand the values-based network that all of us believe in. And that will not only benefit the three countries involved, but it'll benefit Southeast Asia. Quite frankly, it will benefit the entire world. Before I turn it over to our superb panelists, I would like to introduce a friend of mine and a friend to all of you, and certainly of the Wilson Center, John Negroponte. John is a career diplomat with postings all around the world, of course, former ambassador to the United Nations and director of national intelligence. He is an enormous asset to the Wilson Center and a leader within the Wilson Center. When crafting the 2023 Trilateral Commission, we knew that he would bring an unmatched level of experience and expertise. He is a member of the Wilson Center's Global Advisory Council, Chairman Emeritus of the Council of the Americas, and Vice Chairman at McClarty Associates. You might assume after hearing all of this that he can't hold a job. Instead, he holds many, many jobs, many titles, many positions. John, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate the kind introduction, and I'm delighted to be with you this morning in my capacity as one of the co-chairs of this panel on trilateral relationships between the United States, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. And my two fellow commissioners, if you will, are Mr. Ambassador Sung-Hwan Kim, who's on the screen this morning with us, participating, I believe, from Seoul, South Korea, and whom I had last had the privilege of seeing when we attended a conference together in the People's Republic of China. But that's another story. And then the other commission member, panel member, is Ambassador Kenichiro Sasai, who I knew from his time when he was dealing with the six-party talks on North Korea, and then later in his capacity as ambassador of Japan here in the United States, where he had a very long and successful tenure. And I do not believe he will be participating live this morning, although I've been given to understand that we'll hear a message from him. Let me just, well, first, one thing about myself in terms of what expertise, if you will, I can contribute to this panel. I never served in either Japan or South Korea, although with the various jobs I had over my lifetime, I intersected with both countries and their officials many, many times indeed, going back almost 60 years. But I do think I have a bit of real down-to-earth expertise on Southeast Asia to contribute. And since one of the elements that we're going to be considering is how we can forge closer relationships with that part of Asia between ourselves, Japan, and South Korea, I think I may be able to offer some points of view. As both the previous speakers have emphasized, all of this really comes under the umbrella, if you will, of implementing and fleshing out, I guess I'd put it, the Camp David joint statement of last August, when the historic meeting took place between the leaders of our three countries. And I reread the statement today, the joint statement, and it really is an extraordinary document, and it really is a big reach. This is not just an incremental, in my view, does not reflect just an incremental increase in our cooperation together. It takes some big strides and expresses some, I guess, large ambitions with respect to joint cooperation between our three countries in a whole variety of areas. The initial emphasis of the statement, of course, is on straightforward national security issues, but then there is, towards the end, a section on increasing our economic cooperation in many different ways. And those are the areas that are going to be discussed and explored somewhat during the course of this morning. But I think that we should think of this as this is not a short-term project. And I think it's going to be a question of trying to shape these relationships in a new way to confront the new and substantially changed reality that we confront in the East Asia Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region, as compared to decades ago. So I'm very excited about how these discussions are going to go forward. But again, I just would like to emphasize that this is a long-term project or a longer-term project, not just a one-off kind of a thing. And for that, I congratulate the Wilson Center for having undertaken this task. And I think you're really quick off the mark. And the work that you've been doing, and even we're doing before the Camp David meeting, just happens to dovetail perfectly with where our policies now seem to be headed. So I think it's just another example of the timely efforts of the Woodrow Wilson Center on studying the important subjects of the day. So I, for one, very much look forward to our discussions this morning and thank the Center for organizing it. Thank you.
Now we would like to hear the pre-recorded remarks from Ambassador Sasai. Ambassador Sasai was our co-chair member from Japan. We were delighted to have him participate in all of our summer workshops. Unfortunately, due to the time difference and scheduling conflict, he's unable to join us in person, but he sends his regards via a video recording. So we will now hear that next.
It is my great pleasure to say a few words of congratulation at the outset of this conference. May I first congratulate the Trilateral Commission at the Wilson Center for its excellent ongoing work. The Commission worked tirelessly to come up with a set of important findings and produced a draft report, which is full of well-thought-out policy recommendations. They illustrate the ways to strengthen the trilateral relationship in the renewed landscape of Japan-ROK relations. The advancing relations among Japan, the Republic, Korea, and the United States is one of the very few pieces of good news we see in the last 12 months. Building on this historic achievement, the draft report suggests that the three nations, in the spirit of Camp David, should tackle a wide range of issues, from geopolitical changes to economic security, as well as the climate crisis. The most important of all these findings is that we need to deepen and institutionalize our trilateral relations so our three countries can together navigate through uncharted waters in an increasingly difficult world, which is full of uncertainty and unrest. I would say, especially in this context of peace and stability of Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia, I fully agree with the necessity of institutionalizing our collaboration to make it more powerful. We have seen so much momentum lost and so many initiatives set aside through changes in political leadership. The caveat here is that we cannot afford to repeat the same mistakes in this deteriorating security environment. Confronted by an extremely challenging security environment in East Asia, our three like-minded nations can make a big difference. We all see a great deal of merit in setting an agenda for peace among possibly the strongest group of three in the Pacific region, representing the free and democratic values and principles. That includes, of course, how we could effectively and constructively address the issues coming from the rise of China. Let this project be also the first step in shaping and solidifying our cooperation in global terms. The three countries need to go global together, since what happens outside the region impacts this region a great deal, and vice versa. These are the messages I wish to convey to you at the outset of what is going to be a fruitful meeting to wrap up our common endeavor. In closing, I'd like to once again extend my gratitude, my fellow commission chairs, Ambassador Negroponte and Minister Kim, members and project contributors for organizing this event and drafting the final report. Thank you so much.
Next, we will hear from our third co-chair from Korea, former Minister Kim Sung-hwan, who's joining us remotely via Zoom.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
One moment, sir. We're changing the screens here. Give us one moment. Excellent. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Ambassador Green and my fellow co-chairs, Ambassador Negroponte and Ambassador Sasae, and colleagues. I'm very pleased to participate in this Trilateral Commission conference on rebuilding and expanding economic cooperation among our three countries. I would like to thank the Wilson Center for hosting this timely conference and the scholars and experts from the three countries for their participation. I have tried to attend the meeting in person, but due to various circumstances, I'm participating online, and I ask for your understanding. As previous speakers already said, our three leaders ushered in a new era of trilateral partnership at the Camp David last August. Just a year ago, when I participated in the conference here in Washington, D.C., the biggest concern was whether transformation of relations between Korea and Japan can be made. However, over the past 12 months, there have been sea changes in the Korea-Japan relations. Just 3 weeks ago, at the Korea-Japan Summit on the sidelines of the APEC leaders meeting, President Yoon Suk-yeol declared that intergovernmental consultations that were agreed upon between Korea and Japan have now been restored to 100%. The Camp David agreement would not be possible without transformation of relations between Korea and Japan. As a former member of Trilateral Coordination and Oversight Group, which is regarded as a successful model of trilateral cooperation in the past, I really welcome resumption of trilateral cooperation. I strongly believe that cooperation among our three countries would benefit not only the interests of the three countries, but the interests and cooperation of the Indo-Pacific region as well. I also believe that our trilateral cooperation would make a great contribution to advocating open and fair economic practices based on our shared values of democracy, market economy, and rules-based order. I think at the moment, the most compelling task for the trilateral cooperation is to make a working mechanism for effectively implementing the agreements. As I will participate in the next session as a panel, I will talk about this issue later. But before I conclude my remarks, I just want to briefly touch upon the issue of climate change. At the COP28 meeting last week, UN World Meteorological Organization released a provisional report that global temperature has risen 1.4 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels, which means it almost reached Paris Agreement goal of 1.5 degrees limit. So in view of the current situation, sense of urgency for resolving this issue is needed more than ever. I hope our three countries would spearhead the global cooperation in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At this point, we've concluded the congratulatory remarks, and we invite panel ones to join us here on the stage.
So, down to business. I'm excited to be leading this panel discussion about expanding trilateral relations and cooperation in trade and supply chain resilience. Just to give you a bit of background on how this panel has come together. As Kayla stated, this is a project that consisted of a number of workshops. The first workshop we held was this summer, I believe in June, and we asked Troy Stangerone, who is the Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute, to write a paper outlining some of the opportunities for trilateral cooperation when it came to trade and supply chain resilience, but also to outline some of the challenges and how the three countries may be able to put aside their differences and move forward and implement the spirit of Camp David on the economic front. So I would like to ask Troy to give a summary of some of his findings. But after that, I would like to welcome our three panelists who are joining us virtually, and I really do want to thank them. They are all tuning in either from Korea or from Japan. It's late for them. So thank you very much for being with us. First, it has been our great honor to have Minister Sun Hwan Kim so deeply involved in our project, not only today, but throughout the process. He is, of course, the chairman of the East Asia Foundation, and he is the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Republic of Korea. We are deeply honored by your presence here today and for your commitment to this project. Joining us from Tokyo is Ambassador Koji Tsuruoka, who is the president of the International Affairs Research Institute and former Japanese ambassador to the United Kingdom. Ambassador Tsuruoka has been an active participant, and he has been incredibly generous with his time throughout this process as well. So thank you very much for joining us here today. And then finally, certainly not least, is Dr. Jae-min Lee, who is a professor of law at the School of Law at Seoul National University. Again, we've been absolutely honored and thrilled to be able to welcome Dr. Lee and have him share his wisdom with us throughout this project. So with that, let me turn to Troy.
Well, Shioko, thank you, to Kayla, to everyone at the Wilson Center who's helping make this possible, and to the commission members. You noted we did our first meeting back in June, and the commission members really helped me sort of walk through things. And specifically, I want to thank Wendy Cutler, who was very clear to me that, these specific examples, not generic things, not take and talk about, we should do a study on something, so to try and put out concrete ideas that could be implemented. So I hope that I can bring some of that to the table today for us to talk about. But I also want to sort of highlight and put in some context first, and I'm glad that, Shioko, you mentioned, how can this process be sustained? And Ambassador Green, he talked about in his opening remarks that, we don't want Camp David to be a flicker, but two, that, economic growth and a vibrant economy, this is the foundation of national power and military strength. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that, the economy is really a key critical part of this. And I also think, when we think about trilateral cooperation, we all know how fragile it is. So I don't think I need to really go into that. But if we do want this to be sustained, and we do want it to survive, there needs to be tangible benefits that the public in each country can see. And I think specifically, that's important in both Korea and Japan. One, because that's where a lot of the historical challenges have been. But two, because, if security itself, the rise of China, North Korea's own provocations, were going to take and be driving the two countries together, we would have seen this by now. So there needs to be something beyond the security that the publics can latch onto and say, this is an important relationship. We need to take and drive this forward, and we need to keep this going. And so it's within that context that I really kind of want to talk about this. And, we all know supply chains are a key area now. We've seen this during the pandemic, the disruptions. We all know both China's use of economic coercion, but also simply, there was yesterday announced that China was cutting off urea from South Korea again. Some of these are not economic coercion issues. They're simply supply issues, shortages still developing, and other things. And so how do we take and build this out? And, you know, Ambassador Kim kind of touched on what I think is one of the key issues too, which is climate change. Not just simply the urgency, but a lot of these supply chain issues, be they critical minerals and other things, tie into the issue of climate change as well. And so when we think about this, we like to think of these as like separate, discrete issues, but they actually interconnect and overlap and are part of a larger transition that we're seeing, both in terms of technology and economic growth. And so within that context, and Shioko kind of laid this out, and I think the three governments have, you know, I'm going to take and focus my remarks sort of on EVs, specifically EV batteries, semiconductors, supply chains, and then I have other colleagues who've worked on climate change in more depth, and then we'll talk about development assistance later today with Jessica. But so when we think about this, right now we're in a very unique position. If you look at electric vehicles, if you look at EV batteries, the United States, Japan, and South Korea are uniquely positioned in this issue and also in semiconductors to work together. If you look at the battery industry outside of the Chinese battery companies, you have Samsung SDI, you have LG ES, you have SK On, and then you have Panasonic. Panasonic, who has traditionally been the supplier to Tesla, who we all know is one of the forefront leaders in EVs. So when we think about the future of transportation and batteries, Korea, Japan, the United States are all critical partners in this. But we also all know that all these companies are dependent on China, either for critical minerals, either directly, or for their processing. And so how do we take and sort of build this out? And this is where I think, when I talk about how a lot of these issues kind of come together, we can look for ways to cooperate. So if you look at the data, so Benchmark Minerals, which is one of the leading analysis companies on these issues, they project that if we're going to hit the EV targets that are expected by 2035, which builds in IEA estimates, what companies have said, the world needs to add 384 mines for graphite, lithium, nickel, and cobalt. So let's put that in context. So that means in terms of tons mined a year, we need to go from 687,000 tons of lithium mined today to 4 million tons in 2035. That is a significant, large amount. Now, if we look at nickel and cobalt, the amounts needed are less extreme, but you're going to have to get significantly more graphite mined than you will on lithium. So the challenges are really, really large. And so I think this also creates opportunities. We know that these supply chains run through China, but you have to take and build out essentially significantly more than what already exists. And that creates an opportunity to build supply chains outside of China to take and service not just the United States, because we think about this often in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act, but keep in mind that, you know, as Toyota, Honda, and others go electric, they're going to be selling vehicles in Europe. They're going to be selling vehicles in Southeast Asia. So while we may focus a lot on the Inflation Reduction Act, its provisions, in terms of trilateral cooperation, I think we need to think beyond the U.S. market in terms of sales and how we build supply chains that are resilient, not just for the United States or not just for the Japanese domestic market, the Korean domestic market, but also for where we're going to be selling vehicles elsewhere. And so in that context, what we can do is look to take and develop new opportunities. And so here, one of the things I would suggest is that the three governments look to coordinate their development assistance. So, for example, in a lot of these areas we're going to build new mines, there's going to be a need for water treatment facilities, for infrastructure, for education, and other things. All the traditional types of things that we would do in terms of development assistance. But looking at this in the context of how do we do that to support the changes we're going to need to see in terms of new supply chains and building those out. Now, there's one of the things that Shioko mentioned is the challenges we're going to face. And one of this is that ultimately supply chains are private sector driven. We have to have a prominent role for the private sector. But there's also a challenge in that the private sector is competitive. So how do you take and build cooperation to where it's in the interest of each of the companies to cooperate rather than to compete? And so one of the things that I think we can look to here is to try and encourage the companies to form joint ventures. We're already seeing this in the United States. In my home state of Tennessee, SK On and Ford are partnering on battery facilities for Ford's Blue Oval project there. And so I think the joint venture model makes a lot of sense in terms of taking and allowing each of the companies to benefit, to gain new access. We've also seen, you know, GM and Ford are trying to gain direct access to the minerals they need to build the batteries to ensure that they have the supplies. So we need to think about how we cooperate, you know, spread the risk, spread the investment, make this be able to really be built out. And so by working together with our development assistants to build some of the infrastructure side you need, and then on the joint venture side to build out sort of the supply chain side, you can work together as the three countries and the corporate side to really make some of this happen. Now, in that context, I think we also need to think about the volume of this. And so one of the things that I think that Japan already does well is that for a lot of these critical minerals, they have a 6-month supply. The supply is less in the United States and Japan, Korea. And I think it would be important for all three countries to really build up that supply, because if this gets cut off, and if we need the types of volumes that we're going to need going forward, the current stockpiles in the United States and Korea just wouldn't be sufficient. But within that context, we also need to think of how do we cooperate, and how do we take and work on building one of the things they've talked about doing in the Camp David Summit, which is a early warning supply chain program. And so I think we should look to taking, and not just having companies based in, say, the United States eligible for critical minerals from stockpiles here, but if, say, there's a plant in Korea and the Korean stockpiles and Japanese stockpiles are low, we can ship minerals from the United States to Korea to take and make that plant work. So we make it eligible for any of the companies within the three countries, regardless of which country the facility is in. And within this context, part of the ability to take and do that is that the companies work with the governments to try and put forward on a voluntary basis information that would help each country identify potential supply chain bottlenecks coming up. So we try to build the pilot warning system into the reserve system as well to try and provide an incentive and a benefit for the companies for taking part in something that will hopefully benefit us all by identifying future risks coming up. Now, I also think it's important to take, and we haven't really talked about artificial intelligence, but to look at artificial intelligence as another avenue to pursue in terms of supply chains. And the reason I say that is there's a story, it's about a week ago, DeepMind, which is Google's primary sort of AI process, finished a long-term project to where they identified 2.2 million new mineral structures. Now, only a percentage of those are likely stable, but many of them have potential for things like EV batteries to improve efficiency, solar panels, and other clean tech. But we're going to need, obviously, the corporate side to take and look at this and really test these new structures and see if they work and how they might be applied to current existing technology. So I think collaboration on research and through artificial intelligence to try and identify new paths forward, because if on the supply side you're not able to take and, say, develop a new graphite supply chain outside of China, the other alternative is to develop materials for cathodes and anodes that you can use to take and build the batteries without needing graphite or some other types of materials. And so the research side collaboration is going to be, I think, critical too. So now I want to touch on semiconductors briefly. And once again here, the United States, South Korea, Japan, all leaders in either artificial intelligence chips, memory chips, equipment, chemical components that are needed for the production. So all critical players in this industry. But China's catching up. YMTC used what's called advanced packaging to stack lesser powerful chips together to create a chip that in essence meets the NAND standards of what Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron can already do. As you may remember, about a year ago, before the U.S. put in the October 7 export controls, Apple was actually going to switch to using YMTC chips. And so I think as a rough guide, if it's good enough for Apple, it's probably a pretty good chip because Apple is known for quality products. But so we need to be looking not just in terms of how we take and develop chips that are lower down on the nanometer level, but also how we use advanced packaging to take and really drive forward our lead on chip technology. And this isn't a trilateral thing, but I was talking to a colleague recently who said that the CHIPS Act is likely going to be used to help support a joint Korea-U.S. venture in Georgia to where they're actually trying to revolutionize packaging to go from using polymers for packaging to actually using glass, basically. And so if they do this, it'll actually make the chips much more efficient. But so we need to be looking for these types of projects. How do we take and really advance, knowledge on advanced packaging and other parts of the semiconductor industry, including, some of the chemical sides, to really take and make sure we maintain our lead and that we have the high quality products we need, not just for economic growth, because things like artificial intelligence will drive future economic growth, but also for national security reasons, because many of these chips are used to help model new weapons and other types of things. And this is the reason why the U.S. has put the controls on China to try and slow China's own weapons development. Now, I mentioned this briefly earlier, and so I think the last thing I want to put on the table is, the private sector is going to be critical to all of this. We can have the best government policies in mind, but if it doesn't align with the profit interests and the needs of the private sector, these policies aren't going to move forward. And so the one thing I think we need to do, and we talked about this in our committee meeting and everything and all, is there needs to be the establishment of a private sector advisory group with companies from all the countries that would be designed to take and basically develop reports and recommendations for all three governments on how we can advance these policies. And I think this is sort of the critical cornerstone point, because there needs to be this level of cooperation, and we need to be looking at this not just from what maybe makes sense, but how we can actually feasibly implement it. And so I think in this context, including the private sector is really critical to this going forward. And with that, Shioko, thank you.
Thank you so much, Troy. You laid a great deal on the table, and I'm particularly intrigued by this idea of sharing the risk, spreading the risk, sharing the investment opportunities, because it is imperative for these the plans that are outlined in the spirit of Camp David to actually move forward. Before I turn to Minister Kim for his comments, I want to remind our audience who are joining us online that you can actually submit your questions in the chat box that you see underneath the screen on your monitors. And if you do see me looking at my phone, it's not because I'm bored. I'm actually checking for the comments that are coming in. I already see a couple. So with that, Minister Kim, you've already mentioned that you referred to delving into some of the prospects for implementing the agreement in your opening remarks. So we're looking forward to your comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Shioko. Just now, Troy already made a broad observation on the current situation. So I just want to make two comments. Just among his remarks, I want to emphasize two things. First one is institutionalization, and second one is cooperation with the private sector. At Camp David, our three leaders already laid the groundwork for having this institutionalization. They already agreed to have annual summit, a number of ministerial meetings. That is good, but as Ambassador Sasai also pointed out, in the past, we experienced that the agreed system didn't work so well. When there is a change in the domestic political situation, or there is something coming up between the relations between the two countries. So there are concerns about this issue related with this changes in the domestic political situation. As we know, U.S. presidential election is scheduled next year, and in Korea, we'll have a parliamentary election in April. So, as a way of allaying these concerns, I would like to suggest that the Secretariat, Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat, be established as soon as possible to oversee and coordinate trilateral cooperation. And it is still, because it's just my suggestion, premature to which is location of the Secretariat, but if someone asks me where is the place, then I will recommend Tokyo. This establishment of Secretariat itself would not guarantee the sustainability of trilateral cooperation, but I believe that a stronger form of institutionalization would make people think twice. I think this issue also applies to the relationship between Japan and Korea. In recent months, I have heard a growing voice in both countries that Japan and Korea should consider signing a treaty similar to the Elysee Treaty between Germany and France. In view of domestic political situation in both countries, this will not be an easy task, and some say it is premature to raise the issue. But I believe it is necessary for the two governments to think about this issue even as a long-term task. And in Korea, we have a saying that well begun is half done. And I think now is the appropriate time to start discussion on this issue. And the second point, as I said, the cooperation with the private sector. Well, usually governments do not directly control most supply chains, and the private sector play a key role in this area. In most cases, issues in this area cannot be settled without cooperation from private sector. But despite the importance of this element, it seems to me that as this issue was not appropriately addressed at Camp David, even now, three governments should pay special attention to the issue of making the mechanism to engage and coordinate the cooperation with the private sector. I think this is another reason for we need Secretariat office. If three governments agree to establish the Secretariat, they can create department dealing with the private sector in the Secretariat, and that department can work as a kind of complaint center for the public sector, private sector. Or we can establish separate body as Troy just suggested, this advisory group or some consultation group, kind of separate body to coordinate with the private sector. As the success of our cooperation would be judged not by agreement itself, but by how it is implemented and how it is successful. So we should have a carefully designed mechanism to work with the private sector. And in relation with this, it is also very important to make an action plan to maximize the impact of our collaboration. For example, as Korea has strengths in manufacturing, and the US has strengths in source technology, and Japan has strengths in materials, if there can be a complementary division of labor among our three countries, our cooperation would make great synergies in achieving supply chain resilience. And lastly, as the situation has been somewhat changed, I want to mention this. Last week, foreign ministers of three countries agreed to have, this time, three countries means Korea, Japan, and China. They agreed to have Trilateral Summit early next year. The trilateral cooperation among these three countries, not Korea, Japan, the US, Korea, Japan, China, have been somewhat stagnant in recent years due to historical grievances and political differences. I think as relations between Korea and Japan has been greatly improved, we need to think of how to effectively use this trilateral mechanism to serve as a dialogue channel with China and secure a constructive role of China to minimize the risks from ongoing geopolitical fragmentation and supply chain disruptions. Our trilateral cooperation among Korea, Japan, US is closely related with Chinese issue. So if we can have a constructive role and we can have more dialogue with China on this issue, we'll benefit from that. So I will start here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Minister Kim. Your idea of establishing a trilateral secretariat and having a division of labor between the three countries and having synergies, trilateral synergy in the private, in actually developing technologies is particularly interesting. I would like to now turn to Ambassador Tsuruoka for his perspective from Japan. Thanks.
Thank you, Shihoko, and thank you to all my previous speakers. All the points that have been made are very relevant and important, and I must say I agree with everything that has been said already. I'm sorry, I probably will not be add much on what has already been said, as well as what's already in the report that has been compiled prior to the conference, which is, I believe, a work of very high quality and hard work. Many of the findings as well as the recommendations are down to earth and very much to the point and timely as well. So very few points. I perhaps will be emphasizing what has already been said. The first and foremost, as my previous speakers have indicated, economy lives on the actions of the private sector and not the government. And therefore, private sector engagement is a must. How you effectively coordinate private sectors of the three countries is a very difficult issue because they compete against each other, as well as possibility of coordination. And Troy suggested joint ventures or mergers, which again is an issue that will involve commercial decisions because all private companies work for making profits. At the same time, the high-tech area requires massive R&D. Unless you have sufficient capital to continue to improve or renovate or even revolutionize the existing technology, you will disappear from the market. So merger and acquisition is one way of expanding that resource to enable you to develop further high-tech advanced technology, which at the same time could also be an issue that could be questioned from the antitrust regulatory authorities, especially when today the manufactured products are sold globally. The permission or the approval of antitrust authorities around the world will be necessary for these major mergers or acquisition to be realized. The regulatory authorities are in the hands of the governments, but in many cases, they say, or they pretend to be independent from the executive branch. So there is a hurdle that needs to be overcome. And I think this is an issue when you bring China into the loop, how the three countries that have common security interest could look at those mergers as necessary investment in securing security, especially on the economic side, which eventually, of course, will result in a vital economy that is necessary for being militarily strong. So the discussion of economic security just does not rest for making supply chain resilient, but it also calls for traditional, conventional government regulatory regime to look at specific cases, whether they are relevant and deserve special attention. But first of all, engaging private sector is absolutely necessary. And ideas have been floated as to how that can be done, and I'll be very much supportive of having a mechanism to do that. Second, this is the other side of the coin, institutionalization. This is absolutely important because unless there is predictability, which has to be based on stable, reliable, and comfortable mechanism that the private sector can trust, there will be no investment and there will be no meaningful economic activity. And therefore, institutionalize the cooperation among the three is very important. I cannot help mentioning treaties that I have engaged with, which is CPTPP today. I am a bit puzzled why Korea has not applied. It's an available institution. You don't have to create from scratch. Of course, I was much more puzzled when US, the initiator, in fact, and promoter of TPP, left. Of course, I know very well the political conditions existing in the United States, and therefore I am not expecting US to ever come back to TPP or even join CPTPP. But when we look at Indo-Pacific and also have an eye on ASEAN and Southeast Asia, CPTPP is a tool that could be utilized more effectively, that will provide comfort to the private sector in securing a resilient, robust supply chain, as well as protection to investment that will be made in the region. So rather than creating something new, inventing something that doesn't exist today, why is it not wise to look at utilizing existing mechanisms that are available? The same can be said to IPEF, which I think is a very useful initiative from US. Unfortunately, though, the trade pillar of IPEF, which was expected to be agreed, at least in principle, in APEC San Francisco just a few weeks ago, did not reach that consensus. This was due to, in my view, US withdrawal from discussing data in the context of trade. Again, we see the initiator leaving the most important core issue that is affecting high-tech supply chain coordination among private sector, which is free flow of data and security, which was being discussed and which was going to be agreed under US initiative. But at the last minute, US withdrew. The same is happening in the WTO plurilateral e-commerce discussion. When US moves out, things just break down. No more movement, no more progress. Yes, Japan and Korea has had a very difficult time the last few years based on many issues that you already know very well. But we've been able to overcome that, and we can now say we have excellent working relationship that I see bright future. Why it is not possible for US to do the same? This is perhaps more difficult domestically than coping with another country, but this is a task that I think needs to be done when we are discussing trilateral partnership. I think if we have a void, or if we have to remove one piece because of some domestic limitation, then we will not be able to have a comprehensive, a wholesome cooperation. I agree with Minister Kim. Of course, domestic politics takes priority, because if the leaders do not agree, then we cannot move forward, and the leaders have to listen to the voice of the people as well as the result of the election. This is the fate and the good thing of democracy. But then there is also a role for perhaps Wilson Center taking a role as well, to tell the people, the public, that there are important future risks that should be addressed today and not put short-sighted domestic interest ahead of the long-term strategy, especially in countries that make a difference in global issues. Just two more points I may want to raise. We've discussed important future industry potential of semiconductors or climate change as an issue that needs to be tackled, which I fully agree. I think we also have to look at pharmaceuticals. The post-pandemic world has shown that there are very limited sources where necessary vaccines or drugs could be supplied. The three countries, I believe, have the potential of serving the world better by making certain that new drugs, pharmaceuticals are being developed by the three private sectors, as well as by the regulatory authorities in coordination. So I just would like to raise that as an issue that could be more concrete sectoral coordination among the three. The last point is outreach. Now we're talking resilient supply chain. There's no doubt that China, the resources that China provides us, continues to be and will continue to be very critical to us. So, of course, as Troy had mentioned, developing some supply sources that may allow us to go on 6 months even if supply is cut off. There is one approach that could be taken, but then that's really short term. We need to have a longer term. So, of course, we need to find alternatives, or we need to develop more technologies that will allow perhaps one of the three countries develop those materials that are needed for critical manufacturing, producing products that are necessary. Now, ASEAN, Southeast Asia, is rich with resources, and I include in the word resource market. One reason China cannot be decoupled is the size of Chinese market. Many countries' largest trading partner is China today. And there is a reason for this, because China has a large market and private companies profit by doing business with China. Government cannot tell them to cut that off because it will kill their own economy. Same is in Japan, even in the US. So we talk about de-risking and not decoupling. But de-risking requires alternatives to be made available. And that's where ASEAN comes in. In particular, Vietnam. In a number of security concerns, I think Japan, US, and Korea do have common perception with Vietnam today. So talk about ASEAN as a group is one approach that I think we need to continue on. I hope the US president in the future will attend ASEAN Summit. That's a sign for ASEAN countries to be seen as important. They value those gestures. It may not be necessarily accompanying substantial result, but if a leader doesn't show up in a leaders' meeting, this is translated, understood as not being seen significant. It's a slap on their face, especially Indonesia, which was the presidency of ASEAN, was not able to host the US president at the the ASEAN summit. I cannot imagine how disappointed they were. These are political gestures that diplomacy requires, and the three countries can coordinate well, but at the end of the day, it's each country's decision what to do. And I think focus on ASEAN, and then in particular working bilaterally with potential partners, because not all of them think likewise. You have to select, and we have to invest into the country that makes the most difference. And in fact, the US President Biden, visited Vietnam while not going to ASEAN Summit in Indonesia. Perhaps that was a very wise indication of US policy, not going or working through ASEAN, but going bilateral, one by one. Of course, bilateral, you can show strengths against a smaller country. So that's one way of doing it. And of course, I think that's not a bad idea. But I think while we are going to have a better coordination of policies among the three countries, I think those foreign policy decisions are also issues that could be very well coordinated to have multiple effect on one country's action. Now that the three countries on the basis of the Camp David spirit can work together, trusting each other, I think this is a time to coordinate more effectively what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ambassador Tsuruoka. I would describe your words as tough love as we come out of this period of Camp David honeymoon, and we are faced with reality and the need for us to move beyond the rhetoric and actually implement the words into action. So thank you very much for your comments, and also for giving the Wilson Center homework to move forward as we try to implement the trilateral cooperation into policy. So with that, I would like to turn to Professor Lee, who has been waiting patiently in the Zoom room. Professor, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Shoko. I hope you hear me well.
Yes.
Shoko, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Wilson Center for organizing this event for the past couple of months. First of all, I also fully agree with what was just said by Minister Kim and Ambassador Tsuruoka and Troy. Again, the more I think about it, I think the joint statement issued by the three countries' leaders at Camp David is indeed unprecedented and a groundbreaking event. So this is an important achievement, and the momentum should be carried on as soon as possible. I think the start is very good, but the question is, how do we continue the momentum and lead to tangible outcome? So next year, 2024, as said before, will be a pivotal year for the implementation of joint effort for three countries, trilateral cooperation. So next year will be pivotal, and we should do a lot of joint efforts on many fronts through multiple projects. I think the difficulty, so we understand the need for trilateral cooperation, but at the same time, I think we have already covered the difficulty we would face in implementing the trilateral cooperation. The first one is, again, how to ensure innovation. All these issues are new scientific issues, and there are many issues that we have to address from scratch, and we need the active engagement from the private sector. But at the same time, the governmental sectors also try to engage deeply in maintaining the cooperation. Then the question is, how do we maintain and ensure the innovation on the private party and companies for the trilateral cooperation? I think that will be critical because we are now contemplating close cooperation in core emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced semiconductors. All those areas seem to require high level of innovation, much higher level of innovation than before. And the question is, how do we ensure that level of innovation from the private companies in the context of trilateral cooperation? I think that seems to be a critical task for the three countries going forward. And second, in that context, the second question is, how do we ensure the division of labor on the part of labor between the governmental sector and the private sector? It appears that there are things to be done by the three governments in the context of trilateral cooperation, and also there are issues that can be done on the part of the private sector. So how do we ensure the division of labor, or how do we contemplate the framework of division of labor in the context of trilateral cooperation? That seems to be another important question and homework for the trilateral cooperation project next year going forward. And thirdly, the issue is as mentioned before, the closer we go for the trilateral cooperation, the competition at the private companies level will be fierce. They are already competing fiercely on many fronts. And now they will compete further and more fiercely as the trilateral cooperation goes forward. Then how do we maintain the nuanced balance between cooperation on the one hand and competition on the other hand? I think we can do it. The three countries have done so well all the time. And I think we can do it, but the question is, because we are now trying to establish a new network of trilateral cooperation on a new horizon, then we have to find a right balance of competition and cooperation on the private companies level. So that seems to be a third homework that we have to consider. So I think for these efforts, we can try to find some template. As mentioned by Ambassador Tsuruoka, we can consider IPF. I hope that there is a tangible outcome from the IPF negotiation. It may take time, but IPF seems to be a good starting point. And also CPTPP seems to be another alternative. So we can also think about the existing framework of CPTPP for this particular purpose. The only thing we can consider with respect to CPTPP would be that agreement, though very important and innovative, was negotiated back in 2016, 2017. So the question is, how do we upgrade, or are we able to upgrade the CPTPP's core elements to keep up with the changing environment of global supply chain discussion and economic security landscape? So if we can do it, CPTPP can also provide a good alternative framework for the trilateral cooperation, and that will also provide a good starting point for the discussion of new template for the economic governance for other countries as well. So IPF and CPTPP and other fora will be an important platform for the discussion and the strengthening of trilateral cooperation for the implementation of the Camp David spirit for the three countries. So hopefully next year, 2024, three countries can achieve a tangible outcome on this front. I think time is of essence. The people of three countries and the companies of three countries are now waiting, I think, anxiously to see the tangible outcome of the trilateral cooperation. So now the principle is adopted and the joint statement spirit has been confirmed over and over again. And now the actual outcome and tangible results will be an important next step for the trilateral cooperation. So hopefully next year, 2024, is important for the implementation of trilateral cooperation, in spite of the unpredictable political development in three countries. So hopefully next year we can achieve a lot of things together. And again, thank you for organizing this event. I would like to thank Wilson Center and other colleagues for organizing this event. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee. Again, you've raised many issues too. And I know that we've already covered a lot of ground, but starting off with where the Professor Lee left off about competition and cooperation, in the name of resilience, we have seen the rise of industrial policy and subsidies, especially for chip manufacturing. And in other sectors as well. This is in the interest of national economic security and as well as resilience. But how does this square, as we try to talk about trilateral cooperation and the role of the private sector at a time when supply chain resiliency, yes, it is about being able to withstand the external shocks, but at the end of the day, it also is driven by cost effectiveness as well. Let me turn to you, Troy, first.
So, a very complicated question. So, I think there's a couple different aspects to this. One, whether you're looking at this because of the concerns during the pandemic about supply chains, or whether you're looking at this from a broader, we'll say, economic security perspective, in the sense of concern about economic coercion and other types of issues along those lines, we need to be thoughtful in how we do this. And the reason I say that is when you take and try to move supply chains, because the corporate sector is trying to do it based on cost efficiency, what is the cheapest, quickest way we can produce a good? Now, there are some things clearly we've decided, and this is probably fair from a public policy perspective, that are so critical that we are willing to take and pay a higher price to ensure we have access. Now, we need to have a broader discussion about what those costs really are and what that means. But at the same time, we also need to make sure that we're not simply taking and transferring one risk to another risk. And the reason I say that is that, the United States already has some products that can largely only be produced in the United States. And you may recall, this was about a year and a half ago, there was a baby formula plant in the U.S. that had to be shut down due to health standards. And right now, in essence, you can only sell baby formula produced in the United States. I think there's like one or two plants in Canada. And so that meant there was a shortage in the United States. And the reason I emphasize this is that, the idea of, reshoring production to the United States, there may be good reasons to reshore some things, but you need to build in diversity of supply, because if you simply reshore everything to the United States or nearshore to like Canada and Mexico, you run the risk of simply taking and maybe transitioning what was before a political risk with China into a concentration risk in North America. And so we need to want to make sure there's diversity, and this is why you need, I think, to work with the private sector. What are the ways they can most efficiently diversify supply to reduce some of, we'll say, the political risk that maybe we're concerned about without simply creating a new concentration risk? Now, then this gets into your question of subsidy. Some of this is that, production in North America, the reality is for most things is simply higher. So to take and make that cost effective for companies, we have to take and provide a subsidy to take and reduce that cost. Now, in certain areas, you could make a case maybe this is justified. So if you take the question of climate change, if we're going to take and develop and deploy the type of technologies we need, you're going to have to take and provide private sector incentives to shift the production to those technologies. And so this is sort of what the Inflation Reduction Act was designed to do. We can get into the details of like how that does or doesn't discriminate against, you know, Japan and South Korea and other allies and those issues as well. But, you know, for example, Martin Sandu of the Financial Times was sort of talking about how if you really want to address climate change, you have to rapidly deploy these technologies. And so to look at the United States and say, we're upset that you're taking and providing money to do that, really kind of defeats the whole purpose of that. So also then the question is what is your policy objective? Is your policy objective climate change? Is it U.S. domestic manufacturing? Is it both? I think in the Biden administration's case, it was both. But so how do you then balance those things out? Now, also then, I think we need to do a better job, and setting aside even trilateral cooperation with Korea and Japan, just talking with our partners about these policies better, because as you do move into a period to where there's going to be more industrial policy, one, how do you make it as least discriminatory as possible? I said least because there's going to be some discrimination. And two, how do you do that in a way that keeps things competitive and you avoid, you know, a running to the ground on subsidies? And one of the things I'm thinking about is, you know, one of the challenges we face, and the Europeans are kind of struggling with this now with their investigation into Chinese EVs, is how much subsidization of new technologies is legitimate. And the reason I say that is right now, you know, EVs in the EU right now, 8% are Chinese made. They're expected in about a year or two to hit 15%, and so there's a real concern that China could end up dominating the European EV market. The issue is that while some companies like BYD aren't necessarily heavily subsidized and are fairly cost competitive and efficient, NIO, for example, according to the FT, in combination of central, regional, and local subsidies, gets about $35,000 per vehicle in subsidies. How do you take and compete against a competitor who basically, if like, so Hyundai's Ioniq 6 retails for $38,000, but if the Chinese government through its various forms is willing to pay $35,000 for your competitor, how do you compete against that? And so there's going to be a need for subsidies to take and develop EV battery plants and things of this nature. So how do you take and balance the legitimate need for subsidies to spur the production we need if your goal is climate change with the industrial policy subsidies which China has used, which are really designed to basically push everyone out of the market and ensure, you know, that China dominates sort of critical technologies. And we should be clear, you know, if we're looking towards the future, you know, China does dominate the EV battery sector, even though Korea and Japan are prominent players. And going forward, China is also focused on EV technology, so they are the leading producers of most EV vehicles. And so we have a choice. We can't simply say, well, the IRA is bad, we should get rid of it. We have to ask ourselves, how do we want to make sure that the battery sector is competitive, that the auto sector is competitive, and that it's done in a way to ensure that we survive in these sectors, because otherwise China will dominate the future of transportation and energy. And now that doesn't mean China doesn't have a role, China shouldn't be a prominent player in it, but how do we make sure that simply our auto industry, that we don't look back 15 years from now, Detroit is, you know, hollowed out. If by Detroit, I mean the U.S. auto industry in general, because the Chinese have subsidized their way and they've transitioned to these more advanced vehicles that are being sold in Europe, that are being sold in other parts of the world, and that, you know, we've just been hollowed out. And so I know I've gone on a long time. It's a very complicated question. Hopefully I gave a few insights, some thoughts on sort of how you maybe try to balance this out.
No, thank you. You've provided a great deal of food for thought there. I don't know if any of our online panelists have a comment. No? Okay. No. I'd now like to turn to the audience here. If you have any questions, there is a microphone because we are broadcasting this. Please wait for a microphone to come to you, and if you can identify yourself and keep your question brief. There's a gentleman here. Oh, the microphone's not on.
Hello there. My name is Ujjwala Pluri. I'm at U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Customs, Office of Green Trade and Sustainability. And my question is, what steps do you think, you know, U.S. Department of Commerce, customs, state, and their counterparts in Japan, Korea can take to engage with the small and medium-sized business community in Japan, Korea, and the United States and other partners in order to engage in more trade, business, and engagement, given that these SMEs form the majority of businesses, at least in the United States. And through that, perhaps we can foster that bilateral cooperation and educate the general public. I'm just curious what steps are being taken in that front.
So, do you want to take another answer?
Let's take one more question. The lady over here. And then I'm going to turn to our online questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. My name is Roberta Lajon. I am a fellow at the Wilson Center. I am a retired Mexican ambassador. And I heard this morning for the first time the risk of concentration in North America, and I would like you to elaborate more on that. Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of risk, one of the things that when you think about this is how do you take and manage risk? Because risk isn't simply, being cut off because of a policy, but it's also because of a natural disaster. So you may recall as well that about a couple years ago there was a major storm in Texas and the power grid went out. And so the Samsung facility there had to be shut down for 6 weeks because of this. And so there was significant lost production. And that plant accounts for, at the time, it was something like 5% of global semiconductor production. And so if you take and you try to build all of your new production in specific locations without building in flexibility outside of a specific region, then you take and you're creating the risk of concentration. Now, we've seen the private sector do this because in some cases, for example, certain parts of the auto industry produce only certain parts in certain areas. So I think it was a lot of the Japanese companies had a lot of concentration in Thailand. There were natural disasters there. They were shut down. And so part of this is it's not North America specific. There's anything wrong with North America, but just that if you're trying to do supply chain security, if you move the risk from one place and simply concentrate all the production in another, then you're simply creating a concentration risk. And so you need to have more ideally flexibility. Now, one way you can address this, and this is something the South Korean government was actually looking at early on in the pandemic, is through the idea of investing more in smart factories. So factories that use AI to take and be able to take and use automation to then basically, if there is a shortage of something, retrain that factory to basically reset it to produce different items and different parts. And so that's one way you can get around some of this concentration risk. But the reason why I think you see a lot of companies, and this is more expensive because it's not the most market efficient, go with what's called the China Plus One, is that you need to take and deal with the Chinese market, but also take and deal with this diversification risk as well. And so that's where you're seeing that. Now, on the SME question, I think this is one of the real challenges that the governments face. When we did the Chorus FTA, there was a real significant push to try and bring SMEs from both countries into this. And the two governments created a portal for SMEs to be able to go on and try to communicate with themselves, with other companies, but they never got much interest. And so part of this, we found is that there are language and legal barriers that are challenging for SMEs. And so if you look historically, a lot of SMEs only trade with one or two other countries. And oftentimes, it's with Canada or Mexico because they're nearby. So some of this is a language barrier issue. Some of this is improving understanding of the legal requirements for working in other countries. But part of it is just trying to take and expose them to the opportunities. And so I think this might be easier as we're in these new areas. I was on a trip, and this was more Ohio looking for investment rather than the other way around. But everyone kind of realizes at some point on the EV side, you're going to move into battery recycling because you can actually reuse all the minerals. Now, there's not enough batteries out there yet that need to be recycled for this to really take off, but people are starting to think about it. And so how in these emerging areas do you try to draw SMEs in and then maybe connect them with, the Samsung SDIs or Panasonic or something, so that way they become the source for the recycled materials. But so I think some of it is thinking through where the opportunities are, but then some of it is these sort of traditional barriers SMEs have always faced.
Thanks. So I'm going to take a couple of questions online. One is from Hiroaki Nakanishi, who is a member of Japan's Liberal Democratic Party, and he asks about the role that the three countries can play in ensuring the security of Taiwan, specifically from the semiconductor industry perspective. It's really elaborating on the possibility of a Chip 4 alliance. And then the other question I would like to pose to the panelists is from Yunjin Kan, who asks, there are worries about abandonment by Washington if relations between the United States and China get better. How will trilateral cooperation change if G2 relations change? So perhaps I can turn to our panelists online, not to put you on the spot, but Minister Kim, if I can ask you for your thoughts.
Well, on the issue of security of Taiwan, it's beyond our capability to do that. You see, U.S. is now giving strong commitment to defend Taiwan in case of emergency. But in the last summit between President Biden and President Xi Jinping, President Xi Jinping said there is no plan for China to invade Taiwan. Well, at the moment, security of Taiwan is a very complicated issue. And from the Korean point of view, our concern is in case there is an emergency in Taiwan and Korean people have worries about U.S. troops here, ground troops here may move to Taiwan. So that is concern from us as well. So I think this issue is very, how to say, it's not easy task for us to talk about. And also U.S.-China strategic competition and trilateral, I think even in the midst of U.S.-China strategic competition, at the current situation in East Asia, and our three countries are moving forward to trilateral cooperation. So even under this U.S.-China strategic competition, we can move on there. Yeah, that's what I can say. Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. Ambassador Tsuruoka, if you have any thoughts.
Thank you. Very briefly, first, the engagement by SMEs. This is a very important point. The value of globalization should benefit those firms that were totally local and had no way of reaching out beyond their borders. When I was negotiating TPP, the team had hundreds of meetings with SMEs nationwide in Japan, because major companies can do business on their own, but SMEs just can't. It was intended to encourage SMEs to look into the global market, and that TPP will provide a very safe base for them to engage with the rest of the world. Now, concretely speaking, specifically speaking, this is e-commerce. You don't need to have a branch in another country to enter into the market. You could directly reach consumers and you could trade them very effectively and comfortably if you have a secure platform. So data is the key. And that's what I mentioned earlier about the importance of having data free flow with trust, institutionalized. It will allow SMEs to be comfortable in doing trade. So dissemination of information, sort of having a public campaign telling SMEs to look into other markets is one, but then providing them with security of doing business is what the government can do. And that can be done through treaties or some arrangements that will make them comfortable. Now, the semiconductor security of Taiwan. Taiwan is now a producer of semiconductors without which the global economy will be endangered, in jeopardy if the supply of semiconductors from Taiwan stops. Many of the highly industrialized economies will have a huge problem. One effect that we see as a mitigation measure for the risks that Taiwan may hold is, again, what Troy mentioned, risk of concentration. TSMC is now expanding production in Japan. They are not just building one, but is also considering to build another one of a major manufacturing capacity in Japan. So this is diversification that Troy mentioned. And I think the value of Taiwan is not just semiconductors, but semiconductors do have a very important strategic importance. And encouraging those diversification of production site, I think, is a very good strategic measure, which also will engage other countries that have those factories to mind the security of Taiwan. Because if the headquarters is destroyed, then the branches will also suffer. So that's one way of actually addressing them. The other issue that I just wanted to mention is all of these subsidy issue concerned with industrial policy. We're talking rule-based international order. This has been mentioned by my previous speakers as well. The first entry point is to make those subsidy industrial policy rule-based. We do have WTO rules. The three countries are OECD members, and we do have guidelines that tell us what we can and what we cannot do. These are the coordination that needs to be done on basis of first existing rules, and if there are modifications that are required for security reasons, we should discuss them. And non-discriminatory subsidization, I think, is a rule. And therefore, insisting on local content is, by definition, discriminatory. And therefore, that runs against the global rules that I don't think will be promoting economic development or economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Professor Lee, I'm going to turn to you for the final word.
Sure, Shoko. Thank you. Thank you very much for the thoughtful questions. Well, with respect, from the perspective of economic security, from the perspective of economic security in Taiwan and semiconductors, I think the four members, including three countries, have already operating Chip 4 Alliance. And they are considering many elements of supply chains of semiconductors. So in that context, Taiwan's situation and Taiwan's semiconductor industry is already closely interlinked with trilateral cooperation, at least in the context of semiconductors and largely economic security as well. So the trilateral cooperation will be pivotal in dealing with future contingencies, perhaps some economic coercion or some other unexpected development will be, I think, should be dealt with in the context of Chip 4 Alliance and the Trilateral Cooperation Network as well. With respect to the SMEs, I fully agree with what was just mentioned by Ambassador Soroka and Troy. I think big corporations are okay. Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, Toshiba, or Apple. Those companies are okay, I think, when it comes to economic security's new landscape occurring in the economic security situation. But SMEs are quite struggling these days. There are many issues for them. I think one of the main issues for them is the unclear regulatory framework, unclear regulatory situation for them. So perhaps three countries can try to provide more clarity when it comes to new regulation stemming from economic security or supply chain reformulation. Then some education, training program, outreach activity for SMEs will be helpful. Finally, with respect to subsidy, I think the real issue now is we have to find a guideline for good subsidy and bad subsidy. The WTO subsidy agreement is clear, but it does not actually divide clearly what is good subsidy and what is bad subsidy, and that is the source of contention for all these industrial policies at the moment. So what three countries can do in the context of trilateral cooperation, in the context of formulating new template for future trilateral cooperation, and for other countries as well, would be find some guideline for permissible subsidies, permissible industrial policy, and non-permissible or bad subsidy programs for the new situation in the economic landscape. So that could be one thing that three countries can do. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Lee, for that insight. And this brings us to the conclusion of this first panel. I'd very much like to thank Minister Kim, Ambassador Tsuruoka, Professor Lee, and of course, Troy, who's here with me today. And thank you for joining us, and to those online, thank you for participating, especially for those who have submitted questions. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to all of them. We now have a coffee break. Coffee is outside. Please come back at 11. 10 minutes. Thanks.
Well, thank you everyone who's joining us here in person and online and sticking around with us for panel 2. Earlier today, former Minister Kim Seung-hwan had reminded us of a Korean saying, 시작이 반이다, which means to start is to half be done. And I'd like to let everyone know we're halfway through this conference, but I don't want to say that we're anywhere near done, because at this point we have a lovely challenge of talking about two very important issues within the US, South Korea, and Japan trilateral relationship. That is on the climate and energy side, as well as on what are areas for engagement for Southeast Asia. Now, earlier today, Shihoko had flagged that this project really was part of a larger vision to look at non-traditional security aspects. So that includes supply chain, trade architecture, energy and climate, and more importantly as well, an outreach to other regions or a broader region within the Indo-Pacific, so Southeast Asia. So our lucky panelists here are going to be joining us to talk through two topics simultaneously, and in order to have a conversation that's more integrated. I think a lot of what we heard from panel 1 emphasized the point that you can't talk about trade without talking about the supply chain components. You can't talk about supply chain without referencing the energy connectivity, and we can't talk about just South Korea, the US, and Japan in isolation. We need to have a larger conversation within the local region as well as within the US Indo-Pacific strategy. So today, I think our panelists are going to go through and help guide us a little bit for their takeaways and their interest areas for what we're witnessing. The plan is to hear from each of our panelists individually. Time willing, we'll also have a bit of a moderated discussion among ourselves depending on what topics come up. A lot's already been said earlier today. And then we'll open the floor for questions as well as hopefully take some questions from our online participants. So to set the stage just a little bit, because I do want to hear from everyone here and we'll jump into it. I also think at this point everyone has our panelists' bios for the sake of time, because we do have a large panel. Please refer to their bios, but I'll briefly mention individuals' titles. But to set the stage, we are coming out of an APEC conversation. We had a conversation earlier today about what that meant for US policy, looking at IPEF and what what did not happen versus what did happen. We also are in the midst of a COP28, and we have a representative from Korea joining us who will be talking specifically about that conversation as well. And so there's a lot of things moving and happening in the past couple of weeks in particular. But this Trilateral Commission, as we said, started back last spring. We came through the Camp David Summit, which had many points that were articulated, talking about institutionalizing the relationship across the spectrum, but there were also points that were left out. So there's a lot to be covered and a lot to be said. So some of the areas that I think we'll just have a couple of points to trigger our thought process here a little bit. During the Camp David Summit, South Korean President Yoon mentioned that the US, South Korea, and Japan represent 30% of the global gross domestic product. But also, something that wasn't mentioned but has been discussed lately with COP28 is that the US, Japan, and South Korea also represent 3 of the 10 largest carbon emitters. And so there's a bit of a conversation about what roles are being played in the economic security landscape, but also what responsibilities can be held for climate and energy policy as well. And I think we'll get a little bit more into this, and we have some topics there more broadly. But there's a lot to be said for how the US has served as a pillar in bilateral relationships with South Korea and Japan. An example is the security energy dialogues as well between US and South Korea, which have been ongoing for years, but for Japan that recently started as of last year. And there's not a lot to say for the trilateral component for that, and we'll go into it a little bit more deeply. On top of that, we've seen a lot of vocalization on the prospect for engagement in Southeast Asia. We've heard it at all of the summits. We've heard it on the sidelines of multilateral meetings. We've heard it in many opportunities that they're mentioning this, but we're not hearing as precise, specific conversations as we could be hearing. And there's definitely some crossover where the industry relationship, when it comes to industry and climate focus, could reach into Southeast Asia cooperation as well. So without further ado, I do want to jump straight into the panelists, kind of setting this out. We've asked each of our panelists to offer some insights to start us off. And the hope is that you'll also maybe flag if there's any takeaways from APEC, as well as COP28 in this part. And I do want to offer, since Ambassador Negroponte, you are sitting right next to me, and you've already spoken, we've heard you speak wonderfully today, but for our audience who might be just joining us, it would be wonderful if you could start us off with any remarks you would like to share.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on the panel. I'll be fairly brief because I'm not sure I have that much more to add at this stage, although a couple of things I wanted to react to from the last panel, especially when I heard the discussion about semiconductors and Japan, US, Korea, and I was thinking, and Taiwan, I was thinking about the country to which I was ambassador, which is in Southeast Asia, which is the country of the Philippines. I was ambassador back there some 30 years ago. And you know, if you go to the northernmost part of the Philippines, you don't have to have that good eyes to practically be able to see Taiwan across the way. I mean, if the balloon ever goes up in Taiwan, it's going to go up in the Philippines as well. And they're the sort of next in line, if you will. But there's another thing that occurs to me, which I think is kind of interesting, is that Texas Instruments has been building semiconductors in the Philippines for 40 or 50 years. I don't know how, as long as semiconductors have existed. And so, you know, you want to talk about security of supply chain and diversifying your sources. You don't only have to do in Korea and Japan, which I know are, and particularly Korea, extremely advanced in this area. But I don't think Texas Instruments, I don't think they're anything to sneeze at either. And I think that in terms of supply chain resilience, the Philippines might be an interesting place to think of. And in addition, they have in common what Korea and Japan have with us is that they are also allies of the United States. So they're in that alliance orbit, and there's no question that our commitment to the defense of the Philippines has grown substantially in the last couple of years in this administration, and given the evolving situation vis-a-vis China. So if I were to leave one note in my initial remarks, and as one of the topics we're going to discuss is other regions or looking further into the region, I want to mention the Philippines as a country that deserves particular attention in this regard.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think the Philippines, as well as I know we've talked a little bit about Indonesia as well today during the conversation, and I think we'll circle back a little bit later to the conversation of focusing on ASEAN directly as a larger organization and as a larger relationship, but also bilateral relationships. And
well, let's
so
talk about that later. Yeah.
Definitely. Okay. Thank you so much. I think at this point we might actually turn it over to one of our online participants before bringing it back in person. So I do want to see if Professor Chung would be willing to give us his remarks up front. If I'm not mistaken, you are either calling in directly from South Korea or from COP28. And so it's unfortunate we couldn't have you here on site, but we're delighted to have your direct perspectives and insights into what's happening right there on the ground. So please, we'll hear your remarks next.
All right. Thank you very much for inviting me to this important event. I'm currently in Dubai attending the COP28. And then before actually I came here, I contributed several interviews with the newspapers and then the media broadcasting companies about what were the prospects of the COP28. And then at the point I said, well, I want to be a little bit positive on the sort of the progress that we can make in the COP28 for several reasons, including the fact that United States has agreed with China in terms of the continuous efforts to cooperate to address climate change in the occasion of the APEC. So in the sense that it has been already somewhat successful. This year's COP28 is, I would say, the finance COP. And then as UAE has put a lot of emphasis on the climate finance, at the same time, there is another important agenda on table to discuss the finance matter. That's called the loss and damage. That has been agreed actually last year in Egypt to promote the sort of the financing resources for the LDCs and the small island countries who are more vulnerable than any other countries to address climate change. And then already countries agreed to set up the loss and damage fund as an official operating entity under the UNFCCC track, which is very significant in the sense that countries are further discussing on how we can increase our ambitions to contribute further in terms of the long-term finance. And then because of this progress, I would say that the developing countries have been, sort of the pressured to be able to show they're more ambitious to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the future. So in the sense that we are making good progress. And what about the situation with US, Japan, and Republic of Korea in this COP? Well, let me just refer to some of the activities that I have been personally engaged earlier this morning in Dubai. We had a side event in the Korea Pavilion where we invited speakers from Indonesia, Lao PDR, and also several international organizations, including Global Green Growth Institute, UNDP, and Environment Defense Fund, having the participation from the Korean governments and experts and other foreign experts as well. Here, the question was that how we can generate more opportunities for these South Asian countries in the context of implementing the individual countries of NDC here, Republic of Korea and China, Republic of Korea, Japan, and the United States can cooperate actually to provide various technological experiences and also together with financing resources in the frame of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So there were a lot of opportunities. And then we are talking about the trilateral cooperation and in the context Indo-Pacific strategy that the Republic of Korea has been developing. We also understand that US and Japan has been very much interested in Indo-Pacific region as well. So there are vulnerable small island countries as well, in addition to those big giants in the South Asia. Also, we do have India, which has been a lot of efforts to promoting renewables, especially solar. And then Japan has a lot of interest in cooperating with India. Of course, United States has a keen interest in making investments in India. And then recently in Seoul, Republic of Korea has 1.5 track dialogue with India, saying that we are interested in this as well. Coming back to COP28 context as well, one thing that the United States has promoted is let's triple the nuclear energy, because of the sort of the situation that happened in Ukraine, that there is a growing concerns about promoting more coal-based power plants all over the world. Instead of doing that, if we could triple the nuclear energy, then we can address all these concerns in more serious way. So, and then under this initiative, I know that Japan and Korea has showed its support by signing on this initiative. So that is in line with what the Republic of Korea, especially led by the current Yoon administration, to promote the renewable nuclear technology, not only domestically, also working together with partner countries. So there are good moments that trilateral cooperation can be made on the different financing and energy and other issues as well. So one thing that we have been talking about, what about the setting up the trilateral secretariat in these fields? And then in that sense, in the negotiations, I was hoping that Republic of Korea maybe can discuss with the United States and Japan to join the sort of the same negotiations group called Umbrella Group. So in Umbrella, there are several advanced developed countries, including the United States and Japan, and the Korea belongs to a different negotiation group. If we want to strengthen a similar line of the strategies to address climate change, maybe Republic of Korea can join this with the welcomes by the United States and Japan. So these are good moments, and not only at the global level, international level, in talking about the COP28, the progress in general, but there are several components that we can make more progress in the context of trilateral cooperation. And then in general, talking about South Asia, maybe I was thinking about promoting the hydro and then the green shipping. That has been also largely promoted by the Secretary John Kerry by the United States, and the promoting EV that we have been discussing before, along with the nuclear and some other technologies that I have been talking about. So I know that Japan and the United States are keen on these technologies as well. So we can team up, working together with the South Asian countries that can be in line with strengthening the current Indo-Pacific strategies by the three countries. And then once again, everything is really possible in our own hands. Let me just talking about not only South Asia, but also Northeast Asia a little bit more, because in Northeast Asia, because the climate change issue is probably one of the very exceptional issue area where United States is willing to cooperate with China. And then Japan also, is not, I think that they may be flexible in talking about the climate change issues with China. And the Republic of Korea may need to do so, because there is no exception in addressing climate change issues. So in the sense that in terms of de-risking, in terms of the preparing for any possible future potential opportunities, maybe possibility or discussing about the setting up the sort of the mutual dialogue to address climate change can be also possible. And then in this context, I also finally would like to mention briefly about what about North Korea. So North Korea submitted its NDC to the UNFCCC saying that they want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by focusing on the forest sector. And then I know that Japan has a lot of experiences on this issue area. United States has been the leader in this area. Korea has been very proud of being very successful in reforestation. And if we can talk about this issue, in a broader context and with North Korea, maybe it can be also another good way of not only de-risking the risks, but also thinking about peaceful and sustainable future, possibly when time comes. So let me stop here, and then if there is any issues that needs to be added, I will do that later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think you had laid out quite a lot of different ideas for us to think about. We'll be touching on them most definitely. You mentioned financing, you mentioned just the general energy security environment, which is triggering a lot of focus here. I think also the interesting part about the announcement on low carbon fuel recently coming out of COP28 with 22 countries signing on, including the US, South Korea, and Japan, is definitely a push forward, especially after a more hesitant Korea and Japan last fall when it comes to the Fukushima water release on the nuclear energy side. And maybe we'll touch base on that a little bit because I think this is an interesting acknowledgement of the multilateral engagement that COP28 allows. But bringing us back to the trilateral more specifically, I do want to pull us back again in room because of the expertise in room. We're bouncing between our brilliant speakers online and here. And I actually would like Jessica to go next and pull us back into the conversation about Southeast Asia most specifically.
Okay, great. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much for Wilson Center to include me into this very timely and also much needed initiative. And also thank you for throughout previous months, all the preparations. So I want to echo with all the panelists have been said about the importance of this trilateral cooperation. And I think for this phase, the current development is especially far-reaching for the regional and global impact for two reasons. First, we see this time trilateral cooperation is really just expanding from traditional military security to a variety of non-traditional security subjects, especially on economic resilience and also energy transition, and more importantly, a free, open, and a rule-based world economic order. And I think second is also very important in terms of the convergence of the three countries' Indo-Pacific strategies. And if we look at the three documents laid out by the three capitals, it's very clear that there is a shared belief that these common goals cannot be reached without the region's security and prosperity. So for that reason, I think it's very important the trilateral cooperation cannot just stay within the triangle boundaries. Mm-hmm. It has to be moved beyond. And so the importance is how do we reach out and generate this public good to the people of the Indo-Pacific? And I think it's especially important for them to think of how to deliver, just like what the panelists already say, how to deliver the tangible, actionable, and more importantly, expeditious policy output so that we can create this kind of public opinion buy-in from, the region. And I think this kind of public buy-in is especially important to help each countries to, fend off some of the domestic oppositions that we see have been discussed, among various panelists. You have to gain this kind of public, buy-in in order to gain the international, recognitions and also, to create this kind of fostering and supportive international environment. So for that, I will argue that Southeast Asia is definitely, and especially Mekong region, is especially important because not only the region is the fourth largest, is the world's fourth largest market, and also the largest trading partner for Japan and Korea. And in the wake of the recent supply chain reshuffling, also become the key destination of the three countries' foreign direct investment.
That's ASEAN.
Yes. Uh-huh. And but on the other hand, the ironic turn is that the region is still suffering from a lot of infrastructure gap. So the disparities between countries, or also between the rural and the urban areas, is still astounding, and it needs a lot of external help. And I think that provides an opportunity for the trilateral global and regional outreach to contribute to. And especially so for the case of Japan and Korea, if we look at the past decade, a lion's share of these two countries' foreign aid budget is all dedicated to this region. So I think this is really the opportunity for us to create this kind of tangible and expeditious outcome. And if you look into like a lot of the aid programs and also bilateral economic mechanisms, it's all really focusing on this region. So if we want to see some kind of actionable and quick focal point for trilateral global outreach, this is really the fertile ground for them to look into. So, but for that reason, effective communication and coordination is also very important. And I know some of the panelists already talked about the importance of trilateral coordination secretariat. And I think one thing that we can actually think of is there are a variety of trilateral outreach to ASEAN already, from water management to digital economic connectivities, and also to energy transition and to smart city, etc. So I think one thing trilateral coordination should do is really to kind of finding synergies and also enhancing resource allocations and to mitigate some of the policy redundancies, because there are a lot of similar initiatives already created in the region. And maybe they can, try to find ways to synchronize them, or to have some kind of division of labors, or to create a larger platform such as a Mekong +3 kind of mechanisms, in order to have the dialogue and to have a more efficient conversations with the counterparts in ASEAN or in Mekong to create this kind of impact. And I think a second point on the Southeast Asia outreach is to have trilateral coordination to seek joint programs as small steps to reach out and to bring to build a broader cooperation. In fact, a lot of joint programs already started between the two countries of the trilateral dynamic. In fact, as early as 2009, Japan and also South Korea's aid agencies, KOICA and JICA, already co-sponsored some of those development programs in Cambodia. And in recent years, Japan and United States also have Mekong Power Partnership that is providing bilateral and regional technical assistance to facilitate the regional clean energy development and also regions' power trade and electrical interconnectivities. And they even create a technical advisory group. And also last year, KOICA and USAID also agreed to cooperate on climate change and environmental protection in Vietnam. So all of those bilateral, joint programs should be expanded into a trilateral setting. And it's actually pretty easy to do, given Japan and South Korea have a lot of similar industrial interests in the region, particularly in countries like Vietnam and Indonesia. You see a lot of things already going on, but in the private sector level, trying to figure out this kind of division of labors. I also think that by bringing Korea into some of those trilateral cooperation is also important in creating buy-ins for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework (IPEF), which unfortunately continue to encounter skepticism from many countries in the region. So. The second point, in addition to some of those clean energy advisory technical assistance that trilateral cooperation can work on, is really to deepen and widen the collaboration in development financing. And for that, institutional approach is really critical. Two of the entry points I think it's easy to do is a low-hanging fruit kind of project is for Korea to participate in the Blue Dot Network and also the PGII Partnership of Global Infrastructure and Investment. So first, what is Blue Dot Network? It is a US, Japan, and Australia-led certification scheme to foster quality infrastructure vital to quality and sustainable infrastructure development. And PGII is also last year is a G7-led infrastructure initiative that's vowed to mobilize hundreds of billions of dollars in financing towards quality infrastructure. And I think it's very important to understand these two initiatives. Both are aiming for private sector. So echo back to all the panelists' emphasis on why private sector is really the key for realizing and making actual of this trilateral cooperation. And I think Korea definitely have a very important role to make these two initiatives successful. So Korea have ample industry and finance and financial sectors are already expanding their global footprint in the developing countries. So by promoting Blue Dot Network within the Korean financing and industrial business, I think this will definitely be a very important building block to actually institutionalize developing financing. And secondly, I think it's August, the three Exim Bank, Korea, and also JBank and International and U.S. International Development Finance Corp. They also signed an MOU and trying to figure out a way to pull together their financial resources for future development financing. This is a very important first step, and especially to coordinate their respective financing project. But I think it's also very important for all these three sites, public financiers, to figure out how to align their financing practice, such as using the Blue Dot Network or all the other best practice in order to ensure the best quality infrastructure can be delivered and financed together. But the next crucial step for deepening the financial development financing for the trilateral cooperation is really to bring each other's private sector into the conversation. And I'm talking about private financiers, not just public financiers export credit agencies. And all three countries have very important private banks who are also very important in realizing their development financing. How much time do I have?
It's a few more minutes.
Okay, so and I.
That's good. Yes.
I think the G7 summit already make it clear. It's not just public bank. Private banks are very interesting. Especially in light of the increasing importance of ESG. Citibank, for example, they attended the latest G7 summit because they are increasingly understand their reputation. So they want to be to be folded into this kind of good governance kind of initiative. So I think that we should really use this political momentum to convince private banks on all three countries to join this kind of public-private partnership. And lastly, I think private banks is also very important, not only because most of the public-private partnership projects is very capital intensive, meaning that the public financier cannot single-handedly financing all those projects. And also because private banks have much better market sense to really know what the industries actually need. Mm-hmm. They are much more collaborated and into deep conversation with the industrialists. So by bringing them in, we can really know what is the complementarities can fill in, and to have this kind of deep conversation is very important. And because for the interest of time, I'm going to jump into the last recommendation, which is really to trilateral cooperation and reaching out to the global South or Southeast Asia in particular, should really focus on making the clean energy a hallmark of their partnership. So, for example, in 2021, Japan and US already started this Clean Energy Partnership, which is a multi-agency platform to promote renewable energy and decarbonization technology in the Indo-Pacific. And also in 2019, United States and Japan also have this MOU at the sideline of the Tokyo International Conference on African Development, pledging to expand support to Sub-Saharan Africa's energy transition. And COICA actually also signed some MOUs to expand their cooperation with USAID and also UNDP in order to push for, more of the support for Pacific Islands clean climate resilience energy transition. So for all those kind of bilateral initiatives, they should really expand it into trilateral in order to reflect, the climate priorities of all their national agendas. So I'll just end here. Right.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I really liked how you said in the beginning that outreach to Southeast Asia is really a step broader for trilateral to step into a larger conversation, say, for example, in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's a really great way of framing it. I think when people see this on the list of agenda items, they might think, well, of course, Southeast Asia, but it really is showing the next step, and especially referencing back to IPEF and how that outreach and how we can show that to the region more broadly. I think the public-private partnership is also a really intense point. For each of our trilateral workshops, this had come up in the conversations as being highly important, and in many ways taking a spin from maybe the positive outline for COP28 and finding where's the positive momentum for trilateral. In some ways, IRA and Chips for America, I think, there was the positive result was it brought attention to how we can work more closely with allies in the region in the industry, and now we see a lot more direct investment into the conversation, and we see our partners wanting to be here in DC talking with us to know what the policy is. And so there's some ways of saying that there's recognition not just on the government and policymaking side, but also on the industry side that they want to be in the room. And that's come up in many of our conversations here in DC and Korea as well. And so, okay, I think we're going to go with our next in-person participant. So, Jim, if you would like to take the floor and give us some of your perspectives as well, more broadly, that would be excellent.
Certainly. Thank you, Kayla. It's an honor to be here, and congratulations to you all on a very high-quality project. And I do want to encourage people to read the articles or the sections that have been referenced to Troy and Jessica today, because there are a lot of good details in there, specific recommendations that I think are practical. So I'm just going to pick up on a couple themes from the first session a little bit and drive home two particular points in the context of energy in Southeast Asia primarily. Those themes are the need for a sense of urgency or the need for speed, and the institutionalization question. Troy actually stole my thunder a little bit with the example of the Google DeepMind article, because I was fascinated by this. This was a publication in Nature just last week, revealed that they had, using AI, artificial intelligence, discovered 2.2 million new crystal structures that had not been identified before. The kicker in this anecdote, I think, is that this is 45 times larger than the number of such substances that had been discovered in the history of science. So the speed at which things are moving, technologically and in terms of national and private sector capability, is staggering. So I think the shared interests that we have, the shared values, the trilateral piece is not, and I'll touch on this again later, it's not that it's just our three countries that have this unique capability and chemistry to be able to deliver for our peoples, but as a caucus within broader organizations and institutional frameworks, I think we can be incredibly effective and powerful. So one of the many areas of collaboration, of course, that the three countries' leaders had highlighted at Camp David was national laboratories cooperation. And the use of AI to advance material science has been actually one area of collaboration between Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, for example, and KIST, the Korea Institute for Science and Technology. They've been working on this in the past year or so. For over a year, there's been some discussion about maybe Japan's primary National Lab on Material Science, NIMS, National Institute for Material Science, joining that project. or setting up a related US-Japan effort on that front. And it's moving forward, but it's very slow. As you can imagine, the bureaucracy involved in getting researchers and kind of the bottom-up process. So I think the combination of bottom-up research and development, relationship building, exchanging researchers, building these institutional relationships is one strategy, but that can be facilitated with a top-down approach in certain strategic areas. Another good area, also just this week, I think, was announced. IBM published some of the results of studies in quantum science, announced a series of breakthroughs. This is all, again, working with Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, UC Berkeley, and the University of Tokyo. And they've been working on this for several years now. And when you combine quantum computing capability with artificial intelligence, it's going to further change the game much more dramatically on this front. Another reason for speed, I think, is the political fragility of trilateral cooperation. History tells us to expect setbacks. We're in a good place right now. But what survives generally, if we look back on what survived during the recent several-year kind of drought, are certain types of institutions, institutionalized cooperation. So the defense trilateral talks that were set up back in 2008, that continued on despite the political drought and problems in bilateral relationships recently. The Trilateral Information Sharing Arrangement, the TISA, or what was there in place of the Jasomia connection between the three countries, set up in 2014. It went dormant, but then it was able to be revived back, and you're not building up from scratch all over again. The public-facing cooperation, this was mentioned earlier, whether it's environmental, ocean health, medical research, I think can be very useful to solidify relations beyond institution building. We want the public and the private sector to see the benefit of our collaboration, and other countries too, to see that as a normal thing and a beneficial thing. And the Phnom Penh Summit from last year, the Indo-Pacific framework that our three countries put forward, I think is very valuable in this regard, because it emphasizes about being for something, not just against something. So I thought the chapter on the Global South and Southeast Asia was terrific. Good observations and recommendations, development finance, digital connectivity, climate change resilience, clean technology, and particularly getting private companies and NGOs involved. And it also highlighted some of the past efforts that had been tried on the development finance, for example, back in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, that we're now reviving. Just last month, there was a trilateral development finance meeting among the three countries. But we're kind of just getting back to where we almost were before. So that underscores that point. Energy is another key candidate, and here I would highlight again technology, fusion. Again, Lawrence Livermore. It's not that I'm just, that's the only lab I pay attention to, but I'm not getting paid by them in any way. But they have had the greatest breakthrough most recently on fusion energy production. Japan just last week inaugurated the world's largest experimental reactor for fusion with the EU. Korea is a couple of years away from delivering on what will then be the world's largest experimental reactor. We're all investing and putting energy, time, and money into these initiatives. And again, it's not just that our three countries are the only three that are working on this, but I think as a caucus within and bridging the East-West dynamic is particularly valuable. Trilateral cooperation is always hard, no matter what. The strategic benefit, the broader strategic benefit almost always outweighs the narrow tactical benefit for each little area of activity that's going on. It's always more complicated to bring in new partners, different languages, different budget cycles, this and that. So it's usually driven then by the regional office or the broader national strategic calculation, imposing it on the various arms of functional expertise that have to carry it out. But it will pay off functionally, I think, over time if we invest. There is one piece in the recent post-Camp David agreement to invest more on consultation infrastructure, kind of hardware connectivity between whether it's laboratories or offices, beyond just the defense area that we already have relatively good trilateral communication technology. So I think investing in that, let's not forget the hardware solution of how our companies and countries cooperate on this front. The role of embassies can be very important as well, because within Vietnam, within these different countries in Southeast Asia, our 3 embassies have a shared mission of fostering successful relations with that country. They're also little mini interagency bodies existing there within close proximity of each other. So I think leveraging the embassies as nodes of trilateral collaboration can be useful. And then if there are setbacks in bilateral relations or trilateral relations, you can fall back on some of either the 3 coordinated bilaterals or leverage the multilateral enlargement or engagement with Australia, the Quad, the G7. We've already seen Korea being included more and more in the G7, the Quad Plus, OECD. There's a variety of venues that we already have, so we don't have to miss a beat or postpone collaboration or cooperation, especially in these areas of technology. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What I really appreciate is you kind of helped us go into a little bit of context on what has existed previously on the trilateral and the recognition that things have slowed in the past, but never in the sense that things completely regress. We're always going to be starting back where the framework had initially been founded. And I do appreciate that, since there has been talk in DC about how much further and how long lasting and where can we push this. That's the whole point of institutionalizing. I also appreciate the reference from all of our panelists so far about getting that public buy-in, and whether that's in the form of financing and investment, or if that's the form of directly talking to people on the ground, having people on the ground. That harkens back to ambassadors' experience and what it means for the embassy outreach. So I do appreciate that relevancy as well. We do have one more virtual panelist we would like to hear from. So Dr. Misashita, if you're here, yes, there you are. We have heard a lot about climate and Southeast Asia, but I know this is all within a larger economic security context and a broader general security context. So I'd like to hear your comments and your thoughts as well within the security dynamic.
All right, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's unfortunate I couldn't make it to Washington, which I love, but I'm extremely happy to see you all online today. But today I'm going to talk about defense cooperation among the US, South Korea, and Japan. I will discuss 3 issues. 1, the defense role of the alliances. 2, the challenges that the US, South Korea, and US-Japan alliances face today. And finally, 3 things that the US, South Korea, and Japan should do together. First of all, the defense role of alliances. There is one thing that we must understand here, that is the role of the US-Japan alliance. Some people think that the US-South Korea alliances is there for the defense of South Korea, and the US-Japan alliance is there for the defense of Japan, but that's not true. One of the most important objectives of the US-Japan alliance is the defense of South Korea. If there is a war on the Korean Peninsula, Japan would do 2 things. 1, it would provide important main operating bases to US forces. 2, Japan would send its armed forces, called the self-defense forces, to assist US forces fighting for the defense of South Korea. Both the US-South Korea alliance and the US-Japan alliance play a critical role in the defense of South Korea. Japan started to make military operational contributions to the defense of South Korea in 1999, when the Japanese parliament enacted a law that enabled the self-defense forces to start providing non-combat operational support to the US forces fighting for South Korea. In 2015, Japan's role further expanded. That year, the Japanese parliament enacted a set of new laws called Peace and Security Legislation. With that, the Japan Self-Defense Forces could now participate in not only non-combat operations, but also combat operations. For example, they could now shoot down North Korea's ballistic missiles aimed at Guam or Hawaii, conduct anti-submarine warfare operations to protect US vessels operating near the Korean Peninsula, and sweep mines to assist US amphibious landing operations against North Korea. The only problem was that the two alliances, the US-South Korea and the US-Japan, were playing their roles without close coordination. That changed in August this year. Those two alliances are now functioning as one. The US, South Korea, and Japan have already conducted ballistic missile defense exercises, anti-submarine warfare exercises, and more recently, an air operation exercise together. The three countries are also working to make it possible for them to start sharing North Korea's missile launch information in real time by the end of this year. Now let me turn to the second issue. What are the challenges that the US, South Korea, and US-Japan alliances face today? There are at least two challenges. The first problem or the challenge is that the issue of whether the United States and Japan will be able to remain committed to the defense of South Korea in war. What would happen if there is a war on the Korean Peninsula? North Korea would do its best to neutralize the US and Japan in order to prevent them from helping or assisting South Korea in its defense. How would North Korea do so? North Korea has already deployed about 300 or more than 300 Nodon missiles, medium-range ballistic missiles, capable of reaching Japan. When they are launched, they would reach Japan within 10 minutes. With those capabilities, and North Korea has been developing longer-range missiles capable of reaching Guam, Hawaii, and possibly continental United States. So with those capabilities, North Korea will be able to say in wartime, to Japan and the US and Japan, if you are to help South Korea, we will be forced to attack you. Would you be willing to sacrifice Washington or Tokyo for Seoul? That would be the question. We will be put in a very difficult position. The second issue is in addition to the defense of South Korea, the US-Japan alliance has one more objective, which is, or has come to have one more objective quite recently, which is the defense of Taiwan. In other words, the US-Japan alliance is taking care of two theaters of operations, the Korean Peninsula and the Taiwan Strait. In order to cope with this or deal with this new challenge or defense obligation, the Japanese government has decided to increase its defense budget by about 60% in the coming 5 years. But China is big, powerful, and posing a big challenge to us. So the question is, how can the three countries take care of the security on the Korean Peninsula and the Taiwan Strait at the same time? That's not easy. finally, let me talk about three things that the US, South Korea, and Japan can do together in terms of enhancing their defense. First thing that they can do is to talk about how to divide roles among themselves in terms of maintaining peace and security on the Korean Peninsula and across the Taiwan Strait. The good news here is the fact that South Korea has been doing a great job in terms of enhancing its defense capabilities. According to the SIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, last year in 2022, South Korea was in the ninth place, or South Korea was the ninth largest spender on defense in the world. Actually, in last year, South Korea overtook Japan in terms of the size of the defense budget. So South Korea is in ninth place right now, and Japan is in the 10th place. South Korea is developing a very powerful three-axis defense system. When we talk about missiles, we tend to talk about North Korean missiles, but in fact, South Korea has deployed more than 1,000 cruise and ballistic missiles. And just in terms of numbers, South Korea has a larger number of missiles than North Korea, although South Korean missiles are most of them are short-range missiles. So if South Korea can start playing a larger role in maintaining the security on the Korean Peninsula, that would make it possible for the US and Japan to divert larger amount of resources to the Taiwan Strait. And in order for us to better do that, we might want to actually coordinate our operation plans better. We have the US-South Korea alliance has its own operation plan 5015 in order to take care of North Korean threat. The US and Japan has its separate plan called plan 5055 to do the same. So we have to coordinate those two plans going forward. The second thing that we can do together is to enhance our civil defense cooperation. When we talk about contingencies on the Korean Peninsula, we tend to talk about NEO or non-combatant evacuation operations. But in South Korea, there are about 60,000 Japanese citizens living. So in case of contingencies, it would be impossible for the Japanese government to evacuate all of its citizens back to Japan. And actually, there are a larger number of American citizens living in South Korea than the Japanese. So in order to take care of the people in their own countries, South Korea enacted the civil defense law back in 1975 and has been conducting civil defense exercises. Japan did the same, enacted its civil defense law back in 2004 and has been conducting civil defense exercises based on missile attack scenarios from 2017. There are problems. All three countries experienced false alarms recently. There was a false alarm in Seoul, false alarm in Tokyo, and a false alarm in Hawaii. So we must sit together, exchange notes, and find the best way to protect our citizens in a better coordinated manner. Finally, our three countries must work together to build a global defense supply chain. Since Russia attacked Ukraine last year, countries around the world, including the US, South Korea, and Japan, have provided military equipment to Ukraine. For example, while Poland provided weapons to Ukraine, South Korea provided weapons to Poland to fill the gap. Just yesterday, the Washington Post reported that South Korea had provided massive quantities of the US-provided munitions to Ukraine indirectly, probably through the US, making South Korea a larger supplier of artillery ammunition for Ukraine than all European nations combined. Impressive. The US, South Korea, and Japan, all of us have a robust defense industry or industrial base. So if the three countries work together and build a robust defense supply chain, we will be able to respond to different contingencies in different parts of the world. And by doing so, we will be able to enhance the credibility of deterrence on the Korean Peninsula and across the Taiwan Strait. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think that was really helpful to provide our audience a little bit more context of the security dynamic. Once again, we focused today on the economic cooperation and where does that lead for the different regions as well as on energy, but it does not happen in a vacuum. And so we're grateful to have the additional security overlay. I do want to be mindful of having time for our audience members to ask questions. We do have some audience members who can post their questions on our website, but we'll take a first couple of questions. We will take 2 questions to start with from our people here in the room. So I do see a gentleman here in the front. And do we have a secondary question for our panelists to start? Okay, we'll start with this gentleman here.
Steve Jackson, I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center. I'm wondering, harking back to Ambassador Kim's note that there's another trilateral initiative in Asia with South Korea and Japan, only with China, about the degree to which China now seeing this obvious movement toward trilateralism here is suddenly going to try to play nice and to, in a sense, try to draw off some of the weaker members. And flipping that around, to what extent is China going to try to particularly, in a sense, subvert the weakest leg of this trilateralism, which is the Seoul-Tokyo part of that?
Do we have a secondary question to follow immediately? I'll have the gentleman here right behind.
There's been a lot of talk about the more hierarchical command and control elements. But the nature of the new technologies allow for distributed, collectively intelligent grids. And where you're seeing a lot of the new technology bubble up is from the private sector in small organizations. I'm thinking that there's a need, for example, to build resilience systems and resilience capacity zones to deal with the fact that there's massive amounts of economic and climate migrants now around the world, and that's only going to increase. So one of the things that we've been working on through the Alliance for Global Resilience and Regeneration is identifying sender communities and receiver communities that can manage the outflow of people that can no longer live temporarily or even permanently in some areas, and the building of receiver communities that enable rapid assimilation for shelter and for livelihood. And I'm wondering how you're thinking about that, because a lot of your concepts are kind of moving in that direction, but the actual implementation of this kind of cooperation between government, the private sector, the social sector, may play a really crucial role in the next 5-10 years as climate change and polycrisis increases.
Excellent, thank you. So the first question then focusing more on the other trilateral in this space and the question of what does the current more charm offensive that we're seeing coming out of APEC, what does that mean? And then the second question, so I'll put the first question maybe to some of our panelists in the room, but I think their second question would be excellent to hear from Professor Chung a little bit on energy and climate migrants. But however, if anyone else here would like to comment as well, let's start with the first question.
So Japan, Korea, and China's trilateral cooperation have been going on since as early as 2000s. And they're like, up and downs. And a lot of time it actually just like, impasse for a long time because of the dynamic of the trilateral relations or bilateral relations. One part of my policy recommendation is that trilateral cooperation between United States, South Korea, and Japan should not exclude any of this trilateral partners to reach out to other partnership. And in fact, if we look into the Indo-Pacific strategies laid out by three countries, they all emphasize on the openness and inclusivity, which is very important to allow all three countries to reach out. And also, echo back to the first panel, this, fear of abandonment, like how is the bilateral relationship dynamic affecting the trilateral dynamic? So I think for that, we have to be cognizant that this is a trilateral partnership that's supposed to be aiming for a larger, partnership, is to bring in the general well-being of the Indo-Pacific region writ large. So we shouldn't see it as like a zero-sum kind of dynamic of this two, trilateral partnership going on. And the second part is the new technology, and what does that mean by building the resilience of the climate resilience of Southeast Asia or Indo-Pacific region. I think one thing that is very important for trilateral global or regional outreach to take in mind is this, I keep trying to emphasize on the division of labor and also complementarities. I do think that United States, Japan, and South Korea, they can really have some kind of complementarities in terms of their development and foreign aid, strategies. We know that for Japan and South Korea, their foreign aids are very good at building economic or hardware infrastructure. And they have a very long relationship for for the public financiers to collaborate with the private sectors. So they know how to build things economically and also cater to the need of the region. On the other hand, I think United States have good strengths in their network with social sectors and also a wealth of global networks, including with development bank, multilateral development bank. So all those, and also, as well as the global consultancy groups that are very important in ensuring the feasibilities and viabilities of all those projects. I think USAID and JICA and COICA, they should really come together and see where are the strengths and that they can tap into to help support in order to get the trilateral partnership become more cohesive and also well balanced, and more importantly, cater to the need of the Southeast Asia's climate challenge.
Can I just add really quickly on the trilat? I'm a big believer that the Japan ROK-China trilat is a net positive for the United States. I'm very confident that China's going to hear many of the things we want to say to China, but from Japan and South Korea without us in the room, and I think that's a good thing. And on the technology piece, it's interesting what you raise. I would wonder whether the immigration angle or the refugee angle essentially is going to resonate as much with South Korea and Japan as it does here, but the profit opportunity angle of companies and whether it's getting chambers of commerce working together in a trilateral form, I'm just trying to align the incentives on that front might be more productive, but it's a good point that you raise, an important issue.
Ambassador, would you also like to chime in on either of the questions before we turn to our online, or any closing remarks, because we're also...
Yeah, maybe closing remarks.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Just two things, that takeaways. One is we have to think as a commission about how basically we bring the private sector into this. Yes. But I mean, that needs to be discussed, because there are obviously many different ways that we can think about that. So that's, I think, an assignment for us.
Yeah, a bit of our homework.
It's part of the homework. Without creating some new, cumbersome, ornate structure. Second, nuclear energy strategy. It just seems to me that's something where more can be done between the three countries. Nuclear has, as we all know, its ups and downs in terms of popular acceptance, whether you're watching China Syndrome or Fukushima or whatever. 3 Mile Island, then when all this stuff started. And so I'm glad to see it getting a little bit of respectability again out of COP and others. Even, John Kerry, I talked to him a few years ago, he said, well, it's a tool in the toolkit. And I think people are more and more thinking about it as an important tool in the toolkit. And we need, I think, to talk about that a bit more, because I think there's some real concrete cooperation that can be materialized from this resurgence of interest in nuclear energy.
Excellent. I think at this point we will hear closing remarks from our two online colleagues. Unfortunately, I think we'll have to move the conversation into our luncheon period. I don't want to keep people away from lunch, and obviously we continue the conversation there. But before turning over for closing remarks from our two virtual participants, I do want to flag that the nuclear conversation is very interesting. We have been working quite diligently here at the Wilson Center to look into nuclear energy policy, and there's some forthcoming research and work coming out on US and Korea. We've talked to our partners in the region, and that could easily be expanded into a more trilateral. So this is definitely some homework we can do here, but there's some good material that will be coming forth as well. Okay, let's turn over to Professor Chung. I think we've been talking for a while. We want to circle back to you and hear any closing remarks that you might have, and to any brilliant updates or sneak peeks about COP28 is also appreciated.
Well, to do so, I only have maybe 1 or 2 minutes left. So let me just try to highlight what I intended to raise. So in the broader context of the discussions made by the UNFCCC track, looking at the South Asia, there are a lot of opportunities, not only in terms of the climate financing, but also in terms of even I was asked to initially talk about climate migrants. There is a initial, really a small island country, Tuvalu actually, who might be sunk by the sea level rise, and they are thinking about the e-government idea. And there will be a lot of issues about the climate migrants and how South Korea, together with Japan and United States, may address this issue. Maybe some other issues are going on. And then there are bigger giants, countries in South Asia. Then in the context, we can approach them with the energy issues. So there are many issues available. Only thing, how we can institutionalize them. I think that this is the sort of the one of the themes that we have been discussing today, and then uniting the three countries through the trilateral secretariat, maybe that can be an excellent idea that I would like to stress. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last but definitely not least in any way whatsoever, Professor Michishita, if you would like to give any closing thoughts or respond to any of the comments or questions that we've had.
Sure. Thank you very much. After COVID, I'm very happy. I've started to, go back to South Korea. I've been to Seoul and other places quite recently twice, and I'm going the day after tomorrow again, and it's going to be a one-day trip. We can do it between Japan and Korea. And the great news is that we are talking about many different issues. I mean, we talked about trade and supply chain resiliency today. We talked about energy. We talked about environment. We talk about traditional issues such as North Korea, and China, and then now we are talking about, not only nuclear energy, but also nuclear weapons and possible nuclear use or nuclear coercion. So that's a scary world in which we are living in. But really, we are really in a good shape in terms of the fact that the US, South Korea, and Japan are talking about those issues in a constructive and forward-looking manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So at this point, I think we'll have to unfortunately pause the conversation in this room here. However, conversation we hope will continue into our luncheon, which will be available across the hall. I have to also say thank you once again to our distinguished and esteemed panelists for joining us here today, both in person in DC and staying up till late hours of the night in Korea and in Japan and in the Middle East. So we really appreciate all of that. Also, before I release everyone, I would be remiss not to give a flag to all of the behind-the-scene work that goes into a conference of this nature. And so for that, I do want to say another thank you to the Korea Foundation, which has been supporting us through this entire process and helping to encourage the conversation. I also want to give a thanks and shout out to our AV team, who's been juggling both our pre-recorded, our remote, and our in-person, handling all of our requests. Also a shout out to our events coordinator. And for people in the room, we actually have 2 of our KF Junior Scholars here with us today, as well as 2 interns, and so I will name them all for their great work. So we have Don and Yedem, who are KF Junior Scholars here with us, as well as Asia Program interns Makdam and Zaina, and I really appreciate their support on site. These conferences don't happen just magically. This goes with months of work and labor, and I think it's because of how important we think this issue is and how grateful we are for the experts that this can come together. So thank you very much for everyone joining us.
That was very good. A great conference.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great morning.
And you gave us good homework. We have things we got to do. We got to get.